This is a talk entitled Ending War, and it needs to be heard in relation to my earlier talk, which was about understanding war. In that talk, I talked in relation to the two wars going on, the two big wars going on. I talked about the idea of fascistic pathocrats being in charge of all the killing. I talked about propaganda, paranoia, projection. I talked about why wars happen, and I talked about a time on our planet in the hunter-gatherer days where wars did not take place. So it's really important that you will have listened to that talk before listening to this talk that's about ending war, because they're very, very connected. So anyway, hoping you will have listened to it, I'm now going to talk about ending war. Put my glasses on. What can we do? What can you and I do, the little person in the street, to be a space that we don't have war in the world? And I also don't just mean war in terms of the big things that are going on with Israel and Hammas and Putin and Ukraine, but I mean the whole space of killing. In my last talk, I quoted Hermann Hesse, who at the time of the First World War had wrote words to the effect that we don't only kill in wars and riots, we kill when we don't give sympathy to others. We kill when we disregard the feelings of others. We kill when we demean and we don't hold people, when we demean others and we don't hold people in their hearts. So this talk is going to look at the whole era of killing, which, as I explained in my earlier talk, is part of the system that we live in. It's a patriarchal world, and part of the furniture of that world is the killing game, whether it's played out in wars or with serial killers or murdering people's hearts because we don't take them into our heart. It's all very much the same. Jesus said, you should put your sword back into its place, for all who take to the sword will perish by the sword. And there's a great truth in that. As I said in my first talk, I felt that Netanyahu's revengeful, over-the-top pursuit of Hammas, without regard to how many Palestinians might, and women and children, get killed en route, was not going to be in Israel's favor. Israel is going to be disliked. Jews are not going to be liked in many parts of the world. And I fear deeply that anti-Semitism could grow as a result. Now, why it was in the hunter-gatherer days, when way before the advent of religion and people lived in harmony with the earth and they moved round all the time, didn't stay in one place. Why there were no actual wars, I think, was due to two things. One, because women who don't ordinarily want wars, they had a very, very large role to play in the communities. They weren't second class. No, it's not quite second-class citizens, but they weren't treated in the subordinate way that they're treated in the world today, especially by people in all the fundamentalist sects and in certain Islamic cultures. And actually also in the West, there's still far more men in high positions in corporations and government than women. Anyway, in those days, the women played a very large part in determining how these hunter-gatherers who moved around the planet, how they operated. That's the first thing. Second thing is that because people were on the move all the time, they didn't amass possessions. And so the egoic thing of greed, of wanting what others have, that impulse didn't exist to that extent at those times. And what are wars about really? They're about power and wanting to have what other people have, and wanting control over other people, and wanting status. And if we look back at our colonial wars that were absolutely terrible, and they were done in the same spirit that Putin's war is being done, without any regard for the well-being of those people whose lands they plundered. We look back to those colonial wars. They happened because male leaders wanted power and prestige coming from obtaining things that other nations had, like land, slaves, and Benin bronzes. I know a little bit about that because I'm very fond of tribal art, and I'm aware how many wonderful pieces of tribal art have been plundered from those countries. So war and plunder are very connected. So as war is part of the system or the story that humanity lives according to at this moment, anything that you and I can do to address the iniquities of our current system and attempt to create a new and more harmonious story for humanity will have an indirect transforming effect on war. I stress once more, war is not an isolated phenomenon. It's part of the system in which we operate. In fact, it's so much part of the system that we've come to regard it as natural. As natural as falling off a log, you start wars. Well, it's not natural. Wars are extremely unnatural, and they reflect, as I said in my first talk, a very pathological and left brain mindset on the part of those people. They're generally men, but not always, who start them. So wars come out of a space of feeling separate. If I feel separate from myself and from you and from my planet, my heart is closed. I can plunder you. I can take advantage of you. And if I feel separate, then I feel an emptiness and I want to fill that with more things. Again, in my last talk, I talked about the greed of people like Putin and Netanyahu and their need for power, status, and control in order to fill the hole of inadequacy that these human beings feel. So the more effort you and I put into feeling more a part of our planet, a part of the human race, and try to hatch a more inclusive and holistic worldview where we realize that despite our many differences from our other human beings, differences in race, religion, skin color, etc., sexual preferences, that we're all part of one human family. The more we realize that, the more we become a space for connectedness and harmony. I mentioned in my last talk, I quoted from the Vietnamese peace activist who said, Thich Nhat Hanh, who said, we all have war inside us, not just the soldiers. In other words, wars don't just happen because warmongering world leaders decide upon them. There's something about the consciousness of the people that allows for wars to happen, because the outer world happenings are very much a reflection of what goes on inside ourselves. So the more that, yes, and I just want to make the point, why countries create warmongering leaders or fascistic leaders, or as we're seeing at this moment happen, a lot of demagogues coming into power. It's because they're elected. And why are they elected? Because somehow the world has become so complex, so confusing, so chaotic, that a lot of people don't want to take responsibility for really facing the real problems in the world. And so they elect demagogues who will create a false story of what is happening in order to give the people some peace, i.e., it's something to do with a lot of us not wanting to take responsibility for our lives and putting that responsibility in the hands of people, strong men, who we think will help us. But actually, these strong men are so self-centered, so narcissistic, so wounded, so incomplete as human beings that they will do exactly the opposite. For example, in America, Trump was elected. Well, he didn't come out of a vacuum. And we hope he's not elected again, by the way. But he was elected because a lot of people wanted what this man offered. So if we, the people, change our consciousness and become more harmonious, we will want more harmonious people to be our leaders. In Argentina, I just read, they have elected a very right-wing fascistic leader. Well, he didn't emerge out of a vacuum. He emerged because a lot of people in that country wanted this kind of leadership. And as we know, when fascistic leaders come into positions of power in countries, it's always a possibility that war will happen, either against their peoples, as we see in Iran, where there's a war against women's rights, and we see this in the Taliban. The more these people come into power, the more there's a likelihood for war. And if we can change our consciousness, we, the people of the world, we're less likely to vote for these people to have power over us. So I'm saying that our consciousness, what you and I emit in our daily lives, has a big effect on the world around us. For example, just to give an example, they did an experiment with transcendental meditators going into crime zones of big cities and meditating on peace. And the crime rate in those areas went right down. So that's the effect of consciousness. Wars happen at one level because those leaders who initiate them have very little vision and very little consciousness. That's why in my first talk, I said how stupid war leaders often are. And we saw the stupidity. I talked about Putin's stupidity and Netanyahu's stupidity and Tony Blair and Bush's stupidity in starting the Iraq war. There's a great stupidity, a lack of consciousness. So the more you and I become a space to seed the collective consciousness of humanity with a new vision of what it means to be human, with a new vision or a new story of a world without war, a world that is in peace, the less likely we are to elect warlike autocracies to arise and thrive. In my last book, Amazing Grace, in my last chapter, I looked at the future. I said that I felt that we're going to go through quite a lot of struggles in the next 50 years, I'm afraid so, on all sorts of different levels, ecological, political, economic, social, but we're going to break through. And when we break through, I believe that we are going to create a planet that will be less conducive to war, because human collectively, we're going to arrive at that, I think it's called the Belfast moment, where suddenly people, the IRA in Ireland said, I'm fed up with war. I don't want this anymore. Let's lay down our arms. So, my dear friends, our challenge, to use that old cliche, is to see how can we be part of the solution to problems as opposed to be the problems. And how we do that is that we work to change our consciousness because low states of consciousness and war are closely linked. And at another level, the war/killing mindset is a habit. We're so caught up and attached to the idea that war is normal and unavoidable that we go along with it. I mean, I still think it extraordinary that Blair took England to war against Iraq, that absurd war that if there hadn't been oil fields there that would in Iraq, that would probably never have happened. Can't believe that he was so dumb that he took England to war, despite the fact that there was the biggest anti-war demonstration that has ever taken place in that country, and he just didn't listen to it. Again, I made the example of Blair. Inside himself, Blair was insecure. He felt he had a chip on his shoulder. He didn't come from a lot of money. And he wanted to be seen as the great war leader, saving the world from Saddam, heroic. But he didn't because war leaders are men who don't look inside them and see the demons that drive them. Blair was unaware of his neurotic impulses that took him to power up with Bush, that made him go to war. So that's why I'm saying that the more conscious all of us become, the more aware we are of the demons inside us that drive us, and the more connected we are to our unconscious or to our soul nature, the less we're going to be a space for war, and the less we're going to elect people to rule over us who are going to be warmongers. So it's really important for all of us to be aware of our dark or our shadow side. What do I mean by that? I mean the parts of us that we're unconscious of. And ordinarily, we like to not be conscious of our dark sides. We prefer to project them out onto others. I'll give you an example of that. I'm quite a friendly, sort of touchy person, but I've got an Aquarius moon in me. So I'm also, and I'm Cancer, I'm a crab. I also sort of live in my shell. I also retreat. But I wasn't quite aware of that. I just thought I was this friendly, open person. And often I would find that when I would encounter men who were retreating kind of men, I'd be a little bit dismissive of them. Oh, you know, they're not out there, they're not contributing to the world, they're retreating. And actually, I was projecting onto them the part of myself I didn't want to own. And that's what we do a lot. We project our dark side onto others. So, for example, that we can do it onto Putin or Netanyahu. It's not that they're good guys, because they ain't. But if we can, in order to not see the inner dictator or the inner fascist inside ourselves, we can project it onto Putin or Netanyahu, for example, or in the old days onto Saddam Hussein. So what I'm saying is that we need to work on ourselves to really look inside, put a magnifying glass into our unconscious, into our inner psyche, and see where those warlike parts of us are. Are we envious? Are we greedy? Can we be violent? Do we want to have power over others? All these sides that so many of us don't own inside ourselves. We need to do that cleansing work. I'm going to call it cleansing work, however we do it. And also, we need to see where we're traumatized. Because as I explained in my last talk, there's a real connection between trauma and fascism and war. And warring nations are often nations that have been traumatized. We talked about that with Russia, who has had a history of trauma going sort of right back to Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Stalin's purges. There's been a huge trauma. The people of Russia have been traumatized. So they elect a leader, Putin, the fascist Putin, who continues the trauma of Russia. And in exactly the same way, my dear friends, that the traumatized human being often traumatizes other human beings, i.e., the wounded person will want to wound other people, or the victim can be the victimizer, so that those same patterns happen in nations. And when a nation is traumatized, it means that a lot of the people who comprise that nation carry the inherited wounds through the generations. And many of us today carry traumas that we've inherited through our parents and their parents and their parents, and they've never been worked through. And as a psychotherapist, one of my big roles is to help individuals work through their traumas. But a trauma that we want to bury our traumas, we want to hide them because they give us pain. And so all the ways we use to hide our traumas, to repress our traumas, is we're very, very busy, we're very social, we take drugs, we drink alcohol. They're all ways of burying wounds that actually need to come out and be healed. So the more we carry traumas, the more we are a space for war inside ourselves. So that it's very important that we do this inner work inside ourselves. And a lot of people want to change the world and have a very, very good, incredibly good intentions. But we, i.e., you and I, if we want to change the world, we need to be the change, as Gandhi said, inside ourselves. We can't change the outer world unless we've changed our inner world. Or as Sri Aurobindo, the wonderful, wise Indian avataric figure, said, to hope for a change in life, without a change in human nature is an irrational proposition, an impossible miracle. Now, for me, the most important thing that any of us can do to end war, to ensure that we're not unconsciously part of the killing consciousness in our nation, is to learn to open and evolve our hearts. Arnold Toynbee, the great philosopher and historian, he understood this and said, the present threat to mankind's survival can be removed only by a revolutionary change of heart in individual human beings, or a change of heart. Let's call it an opening or an awakening of heart. And the peace activist Scylla Elworthy also understood this. The power of change in the human heart is formidable. It can transform violent activists into peacemakers. What she said. Teilhard de Chardin, that visionary futurist, said there's more power in an awakened heart than in an atomic bomb. I see this. And I think that the most important thing that any of us can do inwardly, I'm going to talk about outer things in a moment, but the most important thing that we can do inwardly to be a space for peace in our world is to work at awakening our hearts. And I say this with a little bit of authority. In my mid-20s, I had some very powerful heart awakening experiences. And much of my life after that has been involved in teaching seminars on awakening the heart. And I've seen how powerful it is. I've seen that when a person's heart awakens, that they become much happier. Their view of the world, their view of themselves changes. They're no longer making themselves wrong and criticizing others. They're honoring themselves, they're honoring others, they're honoring the planet. Those people who despoil the planet, who are critical of others, it's because their hearts are closed. They can't feel into the feelings of other people, that they lack an empathy. And what's an empathy? The empathy is what connects me to you. If I can feel into you and have some feeling of what's going on inside you, inside myself. The heart is so important. And of course, I'm talking about our inner heart here. Look, do you like my little Buddha? A friend of mine made it. And it's nice, it hangs around my neck, over my heart. So I can keep the Buddha in my heart. Excuse me. Now, how did Gandhi achieve all that he achieved in India? How did Nelson Mandela, how in hell did Nelson Mandela avoid a painful civil war in his country? At one level, both stood for non-violence, but their hearts became big enough to hold everyone in their country inside them. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, a lot of us have small hearts. They're closed. They don't even hold us inside them. But if we work at healing the traumas, the violence, the darkness inside our hearts, pain in our hearts, if we work at healing that and at the same time expand our hearts and connect to all the wonderful qualities that live there, like love and kindness and compassion and wisdom and a sense of beauty, etc., then our hearts, our inner hearts can expand, our heart consciousness can expand. And then we're able to include more people inside our hearts. Because what's wrong with us human beings is that too many of us just live in our heads, or the left side of our brain that's about rationality. We expand our hearts, they become bigger, and we become bigger as a human being. And we go to another country and we see people who come from a very different culture and religion, but somehow we experience them as our brother and sister. They live inside our hearts. I hope you get that point. Our hearts need to become bigger. They need to evolve. They need to grow. I think it's a myth that we come into the world and we're a human being. Yes, we're born a human being, but I think we have to graduate into it. We need to work at becoming more fully human, and we become more fully human by learning to grow our heart's capacity. And when our hearts are bigger, we have much more appreciation of our world. We can't pollute our planet because we feel our planet as a living being and we don't want to hurt it. It's kind of like, I have a little King Charles Spaniel. I love this little spaniel. And a few days ago, she wasn't well. And I felt that in my heart. I knew she wasn't well. And I could no more hurt my vulnerable little spaniel than I would want to do to hurt the planet. So when we come from heart, or we lead from heart, that is, we follow the wisdom of our hearts instead of what our heads tell us to do, or when our head, the logic part of us, can link up with the heart, the feeling part of us, then we start to see the world very differently. And actually, what people don't know is that there's a brain inside our hearts. There's a very great intelligence. And when it links up with our head, then somehow we find ourselves operating in a way that is appropriate. And by appropriate, I mean we do the right thing. If our role is to move forward and do something, we'll do it. If it's more appropriate to sit back and allow things to happen, we'll do that. And with heart, we find we have an ability to address hugely complex situations in a wise way. And again, in my first talk, I talked about how unwise war leaders are. They don't have a vision of what is going to happen as a result of their vengeful actions. Putin had no vision when he stupidly invaded Ukraine, thinking it would just sort of collapse. And by the way, a great example of projecting our dark side onto someone else was when Putin said, I am invading Ukraine to rid that country of the neo-Nazis. Now, who could be more Nazi-like than Putin himself? But he was projecting it out on them. Sort of Putin's evil, he doesn't want to own it, he projects it out. The evil West, the evil NATO countries are coming closer and threatening me. Actually, the NATO countries weren't threatening Putin. He was projecting that onto them. Perhaps their stupidity in coming so close was that they should have taken into account his paranoia, but they didn't. Anyway, my point is that, as Einstein said, we can't solve a problem from the level it exists. We have to go to a higher level. We can only go to that higher level with heart and mind working together. What war leaders do, and what a lot of world leaders who haven't taken their countries to war, they try to solve the problems at the level, i.e., and they only go to the symptoms and they don't go to the cause. But what allows you to go deeper, to go to the cause, is when the illumination or the torchlight of the heart comes into the situation. And I think it's very interesting that all the creative geniuses in music, in the arts, that they've all come from heart. The great composers. Bach, Bach's B minor Mass. You couldn't have written that unless your heart was vast. And actually, it's exactly the same thing with human beings. When people come to me with problems, I tell them that you're not going to be able to solve the problem at the level it exists at. You've got to go to a higher level. And when world leaders lead from the heart, and not enough do at the moment, that's exactly the problem. But when they do, they realize that what will best serve their country is also in the light of what will best serve the planet as a whole. Now something important is happening on the planet, and that is the emergence of what I'm going to call the feminine principle. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. Pardonnez-moi. And by that I mean that the feminine power is returning very strongly into the world. That somehow was eviscerated when the patriarchal mindset that's all about war and conquering took hold of humanity. I went into a great detail about that in my first talk, so I don't want to repeat it. Again, I ask you to listen to that if you haven't listened to it already. And I told you at the start of this talk that why in the hunter-gatherer phase we didn't have wars was because women, or of female power, or the feminine principle, played a very large role in the policy of how people determine their lives. And it's heartening that although there's a long way to go, that women are beginning to achieve positions of power in the world. And why this is important is because women, in general, unless they've been very, very wounded, they have more heart power than men. And perhaps with the exception of old Maggie Thatcher and a few others, perhaps, I can't think at the moment, but most women, especially those who are mamas, do not favor wars. Most women resent their children being killed. Most women, when they can feel free to be themselves and feel they don't have to behave like men in order to get to positions of power, they represent the antidotal space that will allow the warmongering mindset to fall away. Because women don't want a world where, unless there's some terribly wounded serial killer or something like that. And again, that's why we need to work with our wounds. But women don't want a world where their children die in wars. And I think that the more women we have as heads of banks and corporations and political parties, again with some exceptions, I can think of a couple of fascist women in the world, I won't mention names, who probably need to do a bit more work with their hearts. But on the whole, sort of women can help sort of that the space of women, the consciousness of women can help the patriarchal sort of mindset to fall away. So inside all of us is a female and a male part. And we can say roughly that it refers to the left and right hemisphere of our brains. But us men, we're challenged particularly to open up the right hemisphere of our brain, that part that has heart and vision and can see the larger whole. And also, it's important that we be very supportive of women and help them and give them the space to stand in their strength, because that will help peace in the world. Scylla Elworthy, whom I know slightly, and I found her to be a very who owns this, or who started this organization called Peace Direct, which helps conflict resolution in different parts of the world and trains people to be conflict resolvers. She, for me, is the new type of woman. She's got an enormous compassionate heart, and she's strong. She takes stands. She says no. And that's the kind of new women that we want in the world, who hold the strength and have heart. Because heart alone is not enough. We need strength. we need purpose, and we need determination. For many years in my 30s, I would go on retreats with a wonderful man called Ram Dass. I'm afraid he passed away some years ago. And he told me this story. There was a huge, big man full of anger and violence, and he entered a train screaming at everyone, and he was really looking to pick a fight. And he entered a carriage where a black belt martial artist happened to be sitting, someone who could have felled him in one stroke. But this martial artist was wise. He spoke to the screaming man in a comforting fashion and asked him what was upsetting him. The man broke down. "Oh, my wife has left me. I have all these bills to pay. I can't do it. I'm so lonely and miserable and afraid." Tears came out of his eyes. The story ended with the big man lying down on the railway seat with his head in the martial artist's lap, and he was stroking it. "Tell me your story," he said. And as the big man's woes blurted out, his violence dissipated. And this story touched me, because what diffused the anger was being listened to in a loving and compassionate way and being given a space to talk about your pain. And this is what's needed in the world. Strategies other than violent ones need to be used when violence threatens. And the leaders of our nations need to be much more imaginative. Just generally, why are people angry? They're angry for all sorts of reasons. They feel they've lost out in life. They feel bad things have happened to them. They feel that the government that is running things is unjust. And that anger that festers is an unhealthy atmosphere in the collective unconscious. They need to tell their story. We all need to tell our story. In fact, the reason why I just wrote my memoirs called Amazing Grace was because I felt a need to tell my story. We need to tell our stories. And when we tell our stories, something comes out. Something gets released. It felt very cathartic for me to tell my stories with all the many warts in it and all the many mishaps. So I'm saying what we need is a vision of hope. As I speak, a huge cloud of despair in the world, because our news media tends to focus on all the things that are wrong with the world. I'm not listening to the news much at the moment because I'm fed up with hearing how many more Palestinians have been killed, how many more sort of hospitals have been bombed. And it's not because I don't want to be compassionate, because I am, and I feel these things, and I'm angry at the injustices in the world. In fact, my anger inspires me to write the books I write, and even to give this talk, because I'm angry about war, but I don't want to be overwhelmed with it all the time. I don't need a constant diet of bad news. I need and we need to be aware of the other side of life, the light side of life, the generous and good side of life. And we need to put effort into enhancing and cultivate that side of ourselves, as that's what allows our hearts to blossom. So we need to be out, so we need to give ourselves time each day to be out smelling the flowers and being gracious to our neighbors. We need to spend time, my dear, dear friends, visualizing a world without war. To quote from Mohammed El-Barada from his book, The Age of Deception, imagine a world where we would settle our differences through diplomacy and not through bombs or bullets. Imagine such a world is in our grasp. So let's do that. I would like to imagine that world. And I'd like to imagine a world where heart consciousness grows stronger. And heart consciousness is able to percolate through to the mainly left-brain people who are in positions of power. And that it finds its way to our world leaders and politicians and bankers. If this were to happen, just imagine how our world would change. Imagine this. If to qualify for any senior position in any profession, you'd be compelled to complete a training in heart awakening. And if you didn't make the grade, you wouldn't get the job, i.e., you'd have to do a Serge course on how to awaken your heart if you wanted to be Prime Minister. I'm just teasing, but I'm kind of not teasing. But if this were the case, we wouldn't have world leaders like Putin or Netanyahu or that odious supreme leader in Iran who's at war with his own nation, who kills people who resists him, who shoots women in the eye or has them raped or tortured for trying to resist him, and his bogus, this genocidal man and his bogus interpretation of Islam. These kind of pathological psychopaths, and they're supposed to be religious. You're supposed to be religious. How can you be religious and kill people? Where does the Quran tell you that women have to be put down? If heart consciousness predominated, these people would not make the grade. And as I said in my memoir, my last chapter, my epilogue, I gave 25 excuse me, I gave 25 points of how our new world would look by the end of this century. And here's a couple of points I made. Politicians will learn to be more authentic and honest and refuse to be bought. And gradually all forms of government based on repression will vanish from the face of the earth. All forms of violence and oppression to minority groups also comes to an end. A new value system is gradually born, where honesty triumphs over corruption, kindness over indifference, and generosity over greed. Let's imagine that. Let's play John Lennon's song Imagine and really feel it. John Lennon, he may have had his faults, but he was a visionary, and let's give him that. And if one of the causes of war, and especially as I explained in my last lecture of terrorism, is the huge gap between the rich and the poor. In fact, what people don't know is a lot of people sign up to be terrorists in the organizations because they have no money. They live in a country where there's no money. And in order to support their families, they become terrorists. We don't realize this. Imagine that this gap between the rich and the poor will begin to narrow. At the moment, it's widening, it's getting bigger. And that is worrying. And I don't know quite how it is that these demagogues get poor people to vote for measures that are against their own interest and whereby the rich will get richer. I don't understand this. Yes, there is a lot of generosity on the part of many rich people in the world. I can give you all sorts of examples of famous rich people who are donating their monies to incredibly good causes. But it can increase. It's been calculated that if all the many billionaires on our planet were to give a year's income towards those desperately in need, that world poverty could be eliminated 3 times over. Think about that. In my private practice, I've had a lot of mega rich people as my clients. And I'll tell you something, they ain't any happier than anyone else. If you can buy everything, it doesn't make you happy. And you feel a guilt, and you're imprisoned in these enormous houses you own all over the world. We had a client who had an enormous yacht. This was many years ago before they were confiscated. And he told me that it was really painful because he felt he always had to have it filled with people to show how important he was, but his social skills weren't good enough to generate enough people coming on his yacht so that he could show it off. So he felt that it was just his yacht. Anyway, I want to say a few words about prayer, because if we imagine a new world coming into being, a world that works, a world where there's justice and harmony and kindness, and where we don't abuse the planet, and where there's more love in our hearts, and where world leaders try to do what is in the best interest of the larger whole and their country, prayer needs to be a part of this. And by prayer, I don't mean the gooey stuff. Oh Lord, will you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? My friends all have Porsches, I've got to make amends. Please make me a nicer boy. I don't mean that kind of prayer. I say prayer is a form of living our daily lives in a state of active imagination and visualizing and expressing in the way we live the kind of world that we want. More things are wrought by prayer than this world dreams of, said the dying King Arthur in Tennyson's great poem. So we need to visualize peace with ourselves, and we need to live in a more conscious, prayerful way. Because when our mind is at peace, if enough people's minds were at peace, the world would be at peace. But what we have to do to be at peace is that we have to resolve the conflicts. And there's many conflicts in the world. We have to resolve them in other ways than violently. And I talk about conflicts inside ourselves. I talk about political and economic and social and ecological conflicts. Here's what the philosopher David Spangler said about peace a long, long time ago. But I really like this. I'm just going to read it out. Peace is the resolution of conflict in ways that are mutually empowering to all concerned. It's the ability to accept and embrace conflict and not be threatened by it, and thereby use it in the interest of life. Implicit in this image of peace is the role of communication and communion, the recognition of an identity we share that transcends our differences, even as it is enriched by them, and an ability to touch each other lovingly within the context of that identity. When embraced in a peaceful spirit, conflict becomes a source of teaching, a light on the way. When our spirit is not peaceful and is unaccepting of the diversity about us, we kick the lantern of conflict, and its spilling oil becomes a conflagration about us. Hammas and Netanyahu. The way to peace must take us inward to train us in serenity and the cherishing of the other, that we may grasp that lantern and make it an instrument of illumination, not of war. An instrument of illumination and not of war. In other words, my dear friends, conflicts exist for a purpose. They're not bad. Conflict, Jung said, exists to elevate consciousness. We need to see our conflicts as allies so that we may evolve our humanity in discovering new creative ways to deal with them and so elevate ourselves. If we didn't have conflicts in the world, we wouldn't evolve. But as I said earlier, we can only address the conflict at the higher level than the conflict exists if we bring our heart's intelligence into the operation. Now, I really value these peace marches that are happening on behalf of Palestine. And now there's some that are happening, I'm glad to say, on behalf of Israel as well. Because when we march in the spirit of peace, it brings a new energy into the world. And I would be so happy if by the time you saw this video of mine, that a peace will have begun between Israel and Hammas. Other nations, look, I think that Palestine has been abandoned by the rest of the world. A lot of nations could have come in and done things to help the Palestinians, a lot of the Arab nations, but they didn't because they were too busy sort of minding about what concerned them, and the Palestine issue was not big enough, was not important enough. And that, sadly, is the heartless way that nations operate. They only deal with things if it's in their own interest. And we see this happening all the time. Man, as John Donne said, is not an island unto himself, but is part of the whole. Nations operate as if they're islands unto themselves, even though we have organizations like the United Nations and the European Union. And I say this because I see that the war virus, and I'm going to call it a virus, it's like a sort of terrible curse that somehow attached itself to the human race. And the antidote to this virus is choosing each of us to be a space for peace. And then the more we do that, the weaker that virus becomes. And the less we're going to get warmongers being elected into positions of power. It's like patterns only predominate because we invest in them. It's like the newspaper that people no longer read and they don't buy it, and it goes out, they don't continue their descriptions and it goes out of business. War needs to go out of business as a means of solving problems, because it never does solve problems. Martin Luther King said, "He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love." We need to learn to forgive. In my books, I've written a lot about the importance of forgiveness. And of course, forgiveness does not come from the left side of the brain, it comes from our hearts. I can only forgive you if I come from this place. And so it's a space that we need to live in more and more. It's not something we do, I forgive you. You stole some money from me because you were poor and you felt, well, it doesn't matter. I forgive you. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is when something bad is done to us, but we open our heart to the situation and we understand why that was done to us. We draw that person who has harmed us into our hearts and we try to see the world through their perspective, which only heart can do. And then we understand and we realize that what they've done to us, if we were in their situation, we might well have done to them. So forgiveness is a very important way. It's something that we need to integrate into our daily lives. And it's difficult if huge injustices have been done. At one time in my life, I felt a huge injustice had been done to me. And I lived in a space of resentment for quite a few years. But I realized that this kept me connected to the person I resented, and it kept me unhappy. And so I chose to work on myself to let go that resentment. And I did, and it felt such a load off my shoulders. I sometimes feel sorry for poor Trump, this inadequate man holding so many grudges and hatreds and resentments and having no heart and being close to no one. And you never see Melania around him anymore. She's, I don't know where she is. But how hard it must be to live with all those grudges and resentments. Because when we forgive, then the impulse for revenge falls away. And revenge, again, is something we need to work at because it gets us nowhere. Because when we do nasty things to people, it doesn't make us feel good. Hurting other people hurts us as well. That's why we have to take our hurt into our heart and work with it and feel the pain of the hurt, and then it can dissolve. I'm going to get a little more concrete now for those of you who might be saying, okay, Serge, all this inner stuff, okay, I agree. So let's have something concrete. So here we go. I think that some of us may need to play a role, I don't know how, or in persuading military leaders to shift their attentions away from thinking war to believing peace and investing more energy in soldiers' roles as peacekeepers. And I say this as most soldiers are naturally brave and committed human beings, and if appropriately trained, can do a huge amount of good, offering assistance to those countries which are hit by natural disasters. And let's face it, our world is being hit continually by natural disasters caused by our unnatural way of handling our planet. Poor old Mother Earth is fighting back because of the way that we've treated her, especially over the last 50 years. So I think soldiers can patrol the streets in dangerous areas to protect the local people, and countries must not, peace is not disbanding the armed forces, but peace is seeing that the soldiers be employed in jobs other than killing, and helping. Huge earthquakes. Soldiers can come, dig people out. And I think there's also a need for many more people to be trained in conflict resolution. I'm trained in conflict resolution with individuals. You know, I wouldn't know what to do if I went, if I had to negotiate between two warring parties, because I don't know enough of the situation there. But I think we need to be trained in conflict resolution and go out to troubled areas and work with the troublemakers there. And I think one reason that peace initiatives often fail is that they only are instigated from the top down and not from the bottom up. And I think that we need negotiators and conflict resolvers sort of working at both levels. And that's taking responsibility for the world we live in. Most of us don't take enough. We'll take responsibility for our lives and our families and earning enough money and making sure we pay our mortgage, but we don't take responsibility for the larger whole of life, for having our hearts grow and embracing the cultures and the society that we live in. I mean, a lot of us do, but a lot of us don't. And I'm saying that our challenge is to take greater responsibility for the world that we live in. And I say this, folks, my dear friends, because no one is going to save us but ourselves. Some religions have ideas that the great Iman or the Christ will return, sort of lift them up into heaven, and all will be wonderful after the great conflagration where millions die. I don't like that kind of thinking. It's very elitist. I'm the special one, I'm going to be saved. No, that's not taking responsibility. That actually is a warlike mindset that says, I'm going to be saved because I'm special. God loves me more than everyone else. The rest of the world can die. You and I are creatures of the world. We're part of the society of humanity. We need to take greater responsibility for creating the kind of society that we live in, and this is a heart issue. And each of us have a different role to play. I have this role. I'm not someone, I don't go out into rainforests and confront the guys who are pulling them down. I mean, I think that's an incredibly brave role. I'm not someone who goes in a little dinghy to confront the whalers in Japan and say, stop killing the whales. Fantastic role. I have so much admiration for people who do that. I do this kind of stuff. I talk and I work with individuals and I create seminars on healing and wholeness. And I'm going to be doing some seminars now on healing the war virus and opening our hearts. So actually, if any of you are listening to this and want to come on those seminars, or actually if any of you are listening and just want to talk with me for an hour, no charge, I'm not going to charge, but if you feel that this talk is bringing up something for you and you'd like to talk with me about it, get onto my website, www.sergebeddington-behrens.com, and just get in touch with me. I'm happy to give you an hour, So I say that you and I, need, like Atlas, to carry the world on our shoulders, to embrace the world. because we've got to face the fact that our world leaders ain't going to do it for us, not least because they're the ones who mainly got us into the troubles that we're in. You know, we've got to face the fact. So, to quote Gandhi again, if we want to change the world, we have to be the change. In other words, we have to live, we have to embody, we have to live our life in a way that is peaceful and generous and big-hearted and that takes responsibility for everything that we do. And for me, a big part of why there's war and unhappiness is because of all the troubles in so many countries, the poverty in so many countries, the climate change and earthquakes and droughts and tsunamis that have come. There's a lot of immigrants. There's a lot of people fleeing their countries. And they feel outcasts and trying to, I saw on the news a few months ago, a woman sitting on the ruins of her house, and she was weeping, and she was interviewed by a news reporter and with a translator. And she said, "My house has been decimated, and my husband and 3 children are dead. What am I going to do?" This poor woman, uneducated. Wow. I'm an educated person. What would I do in that situation if I lost my livelihood and my family? And I think that we need to find that dimension of our hearts that has kindness and compassion, so that we take these outcasted people into our hearts, because they need helping. And I know it's a challenging situation, but I think those of us who are privileged enough to have need to somehow open our hearts and support those who don't have in some way or another. A good friend of mine, when the Ukraine war started, she had a little cottage. She lives in the country, and she rented out this cottage. And now, for a couple of years, 2 Ukrainian families are living in that cottage. And she's been very kind and generous to them. And I've seen her since then, and it's changed her life. Because when we give of ourselves to help people, it makes us feel really good. When we give from the heart, we feel really good. So it's as if we're not giving away something, but we're gaining something. And that's the point that we don't really understand. I don't like the fact that so many leaders turn away immigrants, and they do so because they think nationalistically, and they realize that unless they're tough with immigrants, the people won't vote for me. We have to find new ways of integrating immigrants and extend the sphere of our responsibility as the sphere of our heart extends. As our hearts grow from being narrow, closed, empty little things, and they grow bigger, that's what we can do. Because at the moment, too many of us see strangers as enemies. And if we project enemy onto a stranger, that's how they will see us. I have a friend who said to me the other day, actually, I don't think people like me much. What I didn't say to him, but what I realized was that he didn't like people much. And so he projected that they would see him in the way that he saw them. Do you remember the story of Frankenstein? Frankenstein was not born a monster. Frankenstein was born and he wanted to give love, but he was rejected by his creator. And because of the way he looked, people who saw him fled, turned away. So his heart closed down. And he took on the projections of, I'm revolting, there's something bad about me. He became full of rage, and he wanted revenge. So he got his revenge against his creator. And revenge blossoms in a world where there is no kindness. So, my dear friends, look where you carry prejudices. Look at what kind of people you exclude from your hearts. Look at how you relate to immigrants coming in. Poor people with perhaps their skins are a different color from yours, and they're not educated and they don't have money, but they're fellow human beings. I tell you this, I was brought up to be very prejudiced. I was brought up to feel entitled, superior to others, and better than others. It was a horrible way to have been brought up, because when I was young, I looked at everyone from that point of view, but it gave me no happiness, because my soul, or my heart, knew that I was part of humanity. So I had to do a lot of work to change my attitudes. I talk about this in my book, Amazing Grace. And I've managed to do that. And I can honestly say that my heart is open today. And I carry a lot of the world inside my heart in my small way. And it makes me happy. So I say that there is no sacrifice in doing these things that I'm suggesting that you do to be a space for peace and love instead of war and killing. But it's a sacrifice not to. Here's what the religious philosopher Andrew Harvey said. He talked about the idea of our being a sacred activist, which he defined as the fusion of the mystic's passion for God with the activist's passion for justice. And this creates a third fire, which is the burning sacred heart that longs to help preserve and nurture every living being. I like that. We need to be inner activists and outer activists. And some of us are a little bit more one, and some of us are a little bit more the other. And we need to find our particular way of being an activist and realize that we can't all be everything. Joan Baez, who was the girlfriend of Bob Dylan, she got really upset because he wouldn't come on peace marches with her. You know, and she complained, "Oh, Bobby, you know, don't be so lazy. Come on, you know, come and march. You know, you want peace in the world, man, don't you?" Until she realized at one point that what Bob Dylan did was write songs about peace. And he preferred to stay in bed in the morning, not go on marches, because it wasn't his thing. We've got to find what's our thing to make a difference in the world. And it's different for all of us. Now, I'm going to end by being really concrete. Here are 7 specific things that most of us can do to help end war. Very concrete. We can put our money where our heart is by giving to organizations and individuals working on behalf of peace. Again, I mentioned Scylla Elworthy's Peace Direct. It raises money to support and train peace builders in areas of conflict. Or go and work for that organization. But associate with these kinds of organizations if you see bringing peace into the world is important for you. Secondly, that we can help educate people to be more open to ideas about this and give seminars to assist people to release trauma and open their hearts. Again, this is my bag. This is what I do. This is why I'm giving this talk. And again, as I said earlier, if any of you want to spend an hour and chat with me, you know, I brought up stuff for you, then please be in touch. You've got my, and you just Google me and you'll find my website and how to contact me. Or if you feel a need to do any of the webinars, which I'm going to be doing on this subject. Third thing, that we can organize peace groups where people gather to demonstrate for peace. And this is happening a lot now. A lot of people are demonstrating, are taking stands for peace in the world now. Fourth, that we can keep abreast of peace initiatives taking place and alert the media to give them more coverage. The media is very important, as of course we all know, but it's about how much coverage important things like peace gatherings get. But we can also ensure that we have no investments in any companies in any way connected with the war machine. and that none of our taxes go to fund the war effort. We expose where we see evidence of autocracy arising, or autocracy in the making, and do our best to name and shame it. This is currently being done in America around Donald Trump, who is beginning now to talk in the way that is beginning to use language that was used in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. And what is happening in America is dangerous. But there's a lot of people who want what Donald Trump offers, which is fascism and revenge, in his words, against those vermin of the left-wingers and the communists and the socialists and those vermin people who are desiccating our country. I mean, that's war talk. That's war against your own country. And stands need to be taken. Because if Trump is voted for president again, I fear for America and I fear for the world. And so one needs to be very strong in the stands one takes. And I don't think people are taking strong enough stands. And I also, I think the American Republican Party is not a party, it's a radical insurgency. It's a crazy group. But Trump is not the cause. Trump is the effect of a kind of warlike consciousness that has been growing up, of a fascistic consciousness, of people who are unhappy and want to blame, of people who are unhappy and want to be violent, of people who are unhappy and want to, and don't have the opportunity to tell their story. So strength needs to be exerted to take stands, to see that this kind of negative energy is somehow dissolved. Some Republicans have the courage to do this. A lot are too timid to speak what they feel because they're ambitious, and they feel that if they displease Donald Trump, that they'll be exiled from the party, and which they will. And they don't want to lose that position. But I think that that is cowardly. And if our hearts open, we become braver and braver. So, dear Republicans, please work at opening your hearts and realize that inside your heart, you don't want all those things that Trump stands for, whereby the rich get richer, you build more walls against you, and you don't do anything to support and honor the larger world community of which you're a part. Take stands, my dear friends, and open your heart. So, The last thing I'll say is we need to address and name and shame wherever we see evidence of killing in any shape or form. So, I'm going to leave the last word with Sam Keane, who wrote a terrific book called Faces of the Enemy. Sam said, to end war, we have to work at the task of creating psychological and political alternatives to war, changing the structure of homo hostilis and the structure of international relations. This requires a heroic journey into the self and a new form of compassionate politics. If we desire peace, we must begin to demythologize the enemy. We must cease politicizing psychological events. We need to re-own our shadows and be conscious of how we have unconsciously created a warrior psyche and have perpetuated warfare in its many different modes. Thank you very much, my dear friends, for listening. I'm sorry it's been so long, but I've had quite a lot that I wanted to say. And I hold you in my heart, send you my blessings. Thank you very much.